out toward the barn door like he had been reaching for something or someone who never came. Clara didn't scream. She knelt beside him and she held his hand for a long time. It was already cold. She didn't know how long she sat there. Long enough for the horses to grow restless. Long enough for the sun to push through the slats in the wall and lay gold stripes across the hay. Long enough to understand that the thing she had always feared most had finally arrived, and it was quieter than she had ever imagined it would be. "I've got you, Daddy," she whispered. "I've got you." She was the one who rode to town for the doctor. She was the one who handled the arrangements. She was the one who sent word to the neighbors, cooked the food for the visitors who came, made coffee for men she barely knew, who sat around her kitchen table and spoke about her father in the past tense, like it didn't cost anything. She was 34 years old, and she had never once in her life been described as delicate. Big-boned, some said, trying to be kind, heavy-set, stout, and plenty who didn't try to be kind at all, who said fat, said wide-load, said all the words that people reach for when they want to shrink someone down to the size of a joke. Clara had learned to carry those words the way she carried everything else, quietly, without complaint, and with more dignity than the people throwing them ever deserved. Her father had never once spoken to her that way. Harold Bennett had looked at his daughter like she was the best thing he had ever made. And now he was gone, and the only person in the world who had ever truly seen her was lying in the ground at the edge of the north pasture under a wooden cross she had painted herself. She should have known something was wrong when Wade Mercer came to the funeral. Wade Mercer did not attend funerals out of grief. Wade Mercer attended funerals out of habit, specifically the habit of watching which properties suddenly became vulnerable. He was tall, barrel-chested with silver-streaked hair, he kept oiled back from his face, and he wore his money the way some men wore weapons. Openly. Deliberately. Wanting you to see it. He shook Clara's hand at the graveside and said, "Your father was a good man. You've got my deepest sympathies." She thanked him. She didn't trust him. She had never trusted him. But she hadn't understood yet how far he had already moved against her. 3 days after the funeral, Wade Mercer's lawyer came to the house with papers. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the knock. She dried her hands and went to the door and opened it to a soft-handed man in a brown suit who introduced himself as Mr. Elias Dowd, and who handed her a sealed envelope with the kind of apologetic expression people use when they are doing something they know is wrong, but have been paid well enough not to care. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I'm afraid there's been a matter regarding your father's outstanding debts that requires your immediate attention." Clara looked at the envelope. Then she looked at him. "What debts?" she said. "The loan against the property. I believe your father signed the note approximately 2 years ago. The full amount came due at the end of last month. I'm very sorry to tell you that." "My father didn't take out any loan," Clara said. "He paid off this land 20 years ago. I've seen the deed." Mr. Dowd clasped his hands together. "The deed you're referring to was superseded by the lien your father filed in." "He didn't file any lien." Clara's voice was steady. Her hands were not. "My father couldn't write more than his own name, Mr. Dowd. He couldn't have signed a legal document without—" "The document carries his signature, Miss Bennett, witnessed and notarized." She stood there in the doorway of the house she had lived in her entire life, and she felt something shift underneath her, not the ground, but something more essential than the ground. The thing you stand on when everything else is gone. The thing you trust, even when you can't see it. "How much?" she said. He told her. It was more than the land was worth. She read the papers 3 times. Then she found the document he was referring to, the one bearing her father's signature, and she sat with it at the kitchen table, under the lamp, for a long time. Her father's handwriting was a large, unsteady scrawl. He had practiced writing his name all his life, the way a man does who is ashamed that reading came hard to him, and the signature on the deed of the home she had grown up in looked exactly the same. But the signature on this loan document was different. Too smooth, too confident, written by a man who had no trouble with letters. Clara knew it the moment she saw it. She knew it, and she had no way to prove it, and Wade Mercer knew both of those things. She had 14 days. She spent the first 7 of them trying. She went to the bank, and they told her there was nothing they could do. She went to the county recorder's office, and a man behind a desk shuffled through papers without meeting her eyes and told her the documents appeared to be in order. She went to the sheriff, a thin, nervous man named Roy Tibbets, who had kept his job for 12 years by never making anyone uncomfortable, and he leaned back in his chair and said, "Miss Bennett, I understand this is hard, but if the papers are legal—" "They aren't legal," Clara said. "That isn't my father's signature. Now, I'm not a handwriting expert." "Then find one." He looked at her. He looked at her the way men looked at women who pushed like she was being unreasonable, like she was making a scene, like her size and her certainty together were too much for the room. "I'll look into it," he said. He never looked into it. On the 8th day, Wade Mercer came himself. He didn't knock. He rode up to the house with 2 men behind him, and he dismounted in the yard and walked to the porch, like the property already belonged to him, because in his mind it did. Clara came to the door before he could knock. She said, "Get off my land." He smiled. He had a way of smiling that didn't involve his eyes. "Miss Bennett, I came to discuss a possible arrangement." "There's no arrangement," Clara said. "I'm contesting the loan. You can certainly try." He tilted his head. "But that's going to take time and money you don't have. I thought perhaps we could save you some grief." He paused. He let his eyes move over her slowly, the way a man looks at livestock he's assessing. "I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for the property, enough to get yourself somewhere and start fresh." "Somewhere," Clara said. "Somewhere more suited to your—" he gestured vaguely, "circumstances." "You mean somewhere I won't bother you?" His smile didn't change. "I'm trying to be generous." "You're trying to steal from a woman whose father isn't cold in the ground yet," Clara said. "And you rode out here thinking I'd be too scared or too—" She held his gaze, "too stupid to know the difference." Something moved across his face. Not anger, colder than anger. "You have until the end of the week," he said. "After that, the county sheriff will be handling the matter." He turned and walked back to his horse. One of the men behind him, young, uncomfortable-looking, wouldn't meet Clara's eyes. She stood on that porch, and she watched Wade Mercer ride away, and she reached into her apron pocket, and her fingers found the thing she had been carrying since the day after her father died, a small folded piece of paper she had found tucked inside her father's Bible. She hadn't shown it to anyone. Not yet. She knew what it was. She wasn't entirely sure yet what it meant. But she knew the way you know certain things in your bones that it mattered. She had 3 days. She spent 2 of them going through every record her father had ever kept, every letter he had ever received, every scrap of paper he had saved in the old tin box under the floorboard in his room. She found 4 names. 4 other families across the county who had lost land to Wade Mercer in the past 3 years. Families who had debts nobody could explain. Families who had been told the same thing she was being told. But she had no time, and she had nowhere to go with what she knew. On the morning of the last day, Clara packed a bag. Not everything, just the things that couldn't be replaced. Her mother's ring, her father's Bible, the folded paper from inside the Bible, a photograph, a change of clothes. She walked out of the house she had grown up in, and she didn't look back because she knew if she looked back, she would not be able to make herself keep walking. The sun was already high and brutal by the time she reached the main road. She had no horse. Wade's men had taken the horses the day before, an hour after the sheriff's deputy came with the formal notice. She had no money. The bank account, such as it was, had been frozen pending the resolution of the lien. She had the clothes on her back, and the bag on her shoulder, and her father's Bible pressed against her chest. And she walked. She walked for 3 hours under the summer sun on a dirt road that stretched flat in both directions with no shade and no mercy, and people passed her. 3 separate wagons, 2 riders. Every single one of them saw her a large woman walking alone in the July heat, with a bag and a Bible, and every single one of them kept moving. She did not ask for help. She was not willing to ask. She knew where she was going. She had thought about it for 2 days, turning options over in her mind, and she had come back again and again to the same answer, Rowan Creek Ranch. 6 miles east of her father's property. owned by a widower named Caleb Hayes, who had by all accounts kept to himself for the 3 years since his wife passed, and who was known to need a cook because he'd run through 3 of them in the past year alone. She had never spoken to Caleb Hayes directly. She had seen him in town. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, quiet in the way of a man who has stopped expecting conversation to bring him anything worth having. People said he was hard to work for. People said he was cold. People said he barely spoke. Clara thought good. She wasn't looking for someone to talk to. She was looking for work. She reached the gate of Rowan Creek Ranch 2 hours before sunset, and she was sunburned and soaked through with sweat, and her feet were bleeding inside her boots where the leather had rubbed through. She stood at the gate for a moment, breathing, pulling herself upright. Then she walked in. There were 3 men working in the yard ranch hands who stopped what they were doing and looked at her with the frank assessing stare of men who didn't see many strangers walk in off the road. None of them moved to help her. One of them elbowed another and said something she didn't catch, and the other one laughed. She kept walking. She found Caleb Hayes at the fence of the north paddock. He had his back to her working a length of wire, and he didn't turn around when she stopped behind him. "Mr. Hayes," she said. He kept working. "Mr. Hayes, my name's is Clara Bennett, Harold Bennett's daughter. My father passed 8 days ago, and Wade Mercer has taken our ranch through a forged loan document. And I have walked 6 miles today, and I am not here to ask for charity." She stopped, drew a breath. "I'm here to ask for work. I can cook. I can bake. I can stretch provisions for 10 men on a 4-man budget. I know how to preserve meat smoke, it dry, it can vegetables, make bread, make coffee that'll get a man through a 14-hour day. I don't need much a corner to sleep in, and enough to eat. That's all." He turned around. Caleb Hayes was not what she had expected. She had expected hard, and he was. But she had expected cold, and he wasn't, or not exactly. He was something more complicated than cold. He was a man carrying something so heavy that he had organized his entire life around the weight of it. His eyes were gray, or close to gray, and they moved over her face with a directness that was not unkind. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "Harold Bennett's daughter," he said finally. "Yes, sir?" "Harold passed. I hadn't heard that." 8 days ago, in his barn." Caleb looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, a brief, involuntary thing, like a door opening a crack before someone remembers to close it. "Mercer took your place," he said. "He did." "Through a forged note." "Yes." He was quiet again. He looked down at the wire in his hands, then back at her. "My cook quit 11 days ago," he said. "I've got 8 men to feed, and nobody who can do it." "I know," Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You walked 6 miles. 6.5. Something moved across his face that might have been under other circumstances something close to a smile. "You got references." "The men who might have given me references are either afraid of Wade Mercer or in his pocket," Clara said. "I don't have references. I have 2 hands and a working knowledge of a cook stove." "That's honest," Caleb said. "I was raised to be." He set down the wire. He pulled off his gloves and tucked them through his belt, and he studied her for a moment with the gray, direct eyes. "Here's what I'll tell you," he said. "I'm not a man who takes strangers on faith. I can't afford to be. But I'm also not a man who sends a woman back out on the road." He paused. "You cook supper for my men tonight. 1 meal. If there's a complaint, 1 complaint from 1 man, I'll give you breakfast and send you on your way." Clara looked at him. "And if there are no complaints, then we'll talk terms." She considered this. She was tired down to her marrow. Her feet were bleeding. Her bag weighed more than she'd thought when she'd packed it, and less than she could afford to leave behind. "I'll need to know what you have," she said. "Frank'll show you the kitchen. I'll need at least 2 hours. You've got until the supper bell." She nodded. She shifted the bag on her shoulder. She started toward the house, and then she stopped and she turned back. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "Yeah." "Thank you." He had already picked up the wire again. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Cook first." She cooked. She found the kitchen large enough, orderly enough, with a wood stove that needed cleaning, and a pantry that needed organizing, and shelves that held enough to work with if you knew what you were doing. She knew what she was doing. She made a beef stew that she stretched with dried beans and canned tomatoes and a spice combination she had learned from her mother. She made cornbread in the cast-iron skillet. She made a gravy from the pan drippings and a dried apple dessert from what she found at the back of the pantry. She worked in silence. The one ranch hand Frank leaned in the doorway for a while, watching her with an expression she was used to, the one that said he was waiting for her to fail. She didn't fail. At 6 o'clock, the supper bell rang. 8 men filed in from the yard, sunburned and tired, and carrying the specific appetite of men who have worked outside all day. They sat around the long table, and they looked at the woman standing at the stove, and they said nothing, but she felt their skepticism, the way you feel weather, the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm arrives. She served. The first man, a gray-mustached older hand named Vern, who had the face of someone who had been disappointed by most things, took one bite of the stew and stopped. He looked at the bowl. He took another bite. He said nothing, but he cleaned the bowl. The table was quiet for a long time, the specific quiet of men who are eating because the food demands their full attention. And then the young one at the end, the one who had laughed when she walked in, looked up and said, "Ma'am." Clara looked at him. "Is there more of that cornbread?" She brought the pan to the table. There were no complaints. After supper, Caleb Hayes found her washing the dishes alone. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, and he was quiet for long enough that she turned around. "No complaints," she said. "No complaints," he agreed. He was looking at her with the gray eyes, and in the low lamplight, he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with today's work. "You can have the room off the kitchen," he said. "Small, but it's private." "That's more than I asked for. $1.50 a week plus board." "That's fair?" He nodded. He looked like he was about to say something else. Instead, he said, "Good night, Miss Bennett." "Good night, Mr. Hayes." He turned to go. "Mr. Hayes." He stopped. "What you did tonight, giving me a chance when you didn't have to." She stopped. Started again. "My father would have called that a good deed. I just want you to know I don't take it lightly." Caleb Hayes stood with his back to her for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before. "Your father was a decent man," he said. "Whatever Mercer says, whatever those papers say, Harold Bennett was decent, and decent people's children deserve better than what you got handed today." He walked out before she could answer. Clara turned back to the sink. She pressed her hands flat against the edge of the basin, and she stood very still for a moment, and she let herself feel just for that moment, just in the privacy of a dark kitchen in a stranger's house, how close she was to the edge of something she didn't have a name for. She didn't cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't. But her hands were shaking, and the water in the basin was warm, and somewhere in the dark of the yard outside, a man who had no reason in the world to be kind to her had been kind to her anyway. She finished the dishes. She dried her hands. She found the small room off the kitchen, and she set her bag down, and she sat on the edge of the narrow cot, and she reached into the bag, and she took out her father's Bible. The folded paper was still inside. She held it for a moment without opening it. She knew what was written on it. She had read it 6 times since she found it. She knew what it meant, and she knew what it could cost her if the wrong person found out she had it, and she knew she was not ready to use it yet. But she would be. She would be. She folded the Bible closed over the paper, and she held it against her chest in the dark of the small room, and outside the window, the Montana sky was filling up with stars, and somewhere across 6 miles of road and summer heat and stolen ground, her father was lying in the earth that had been taken from them. Not yet, she told herself. Not yet, but soon. She was up before the ranch. That was how Clara had always measured herself, not by what people said about her, not by the way they looked at her, but by what she was willing to do before anyone else opened their eyes. She had the fire going, the coffee on, and biscuits in the oven before the first rooster in the yard made a sound. She sliced the salt pork thin, the way her mother had taught her, and she got the gravy started, and she set the table for 8, and she worked in the dark, the way she always had, quietly, without ceremony, because that was what the work required. She heard the men come in one by one. She heard them stop when they smelled the coffee. She heard the particular silence of people who were surprised and didn't want to show it. Frank, the one who had watched her from the doorway the night before, sat down at the end of the table and said nothing. He poured himself a cup of coffee, and he drank half of it without a word, and then he set the cup down and he said, "You make this?" "I did," Clara said. He was quiet for another moment. "It's good. Thank you, Frank." He looked up sharply, the way people do when they're not accustomed to being called by name by someone they've been dismissing. Clara kept her eyes on the stove. She served breakfast, and she listened. That was something else her father had taught her. You learn more about a place in the first 3 days by listening than most people learn in a year by talking. So she listened. She learned that the ranch had been struggling since before Caleb's wife died, that the grief and the drought had hit at the same time, and the combination had nearly broken the place. She learned that 2 of the ranch hands were brothers Tom and Jesse, who fought constantly but covered for each other without thinking. She learned that the oldest hand, Vern, had worked Rowan Creek for 11 years and had a deep, specific loyalty to Caleb Hayes that had nothing to do with wages. And she learned that everyone on the property was waiting for something. She couldn't name it yet, but she could feel it, the way you feel a conversation that's been paused and not finished. On the 3rd morning, the first woman from town showed up. Clara was hauling water from the well when she heard the gate and looked up. A woman in a dark green dress with her hair pinned precisely and her chin at the particular angle that announces moral authority stood at the fence and said, "Are you the Bennett girl?" "I'm Clara Bennett, yes ma'am." "I'm Edna Marsh. I'm the head of the Calvary Church Ladies Auxiliary." She said it the way people say things they believe will end arguments. "I've come to speak to Mr. Hayes." "Mr. Hayes is in the north pasture," Clara said. "He won't be back until noon. Then I'll speak to you." Edna Marsh walked through the gate without being invited and stopped 6 feet away and looked at Clara the way a judge looks at evidence. "This is a widower's home," she said. "You understand what people are saying." "I imagine I do," Clara said. "It isn't decent." "I work here," Clara said. "I cook and I clean and I earn wages. There's nothing indecent about honest work." "You are an unmarried woman living in a house with 8 men," Edna said, her voice dropping to something more deliberate. "In this county that has a specific meaning. And your size?" She stopped, and the pause was calculated. "Your size and your situation together do not speak well of your reputation." Clara set the water bucket down. Slowly. She turned, and she looked at Edna Marsh full in the face, and she said, "Mrs. Marsh, I've lost my father. I've lost my home. I've walked 6 miles on bleeding feet to find work so that I don't starve. And you've come here to tell me that the way I look is a moral problem." She let that sit for a moment. "I'd like you to think about what your Bible says about that kind of visit." Edna Marsh's mouth pressed into a thin line. She wasn't used to being answered. Clara could tell. "Mr. Hayes should know what the town is saying," she said. "You're welcome to tell him yourself at noon," Clara said. She picked up the bucket. "I've got work to do." She walked back to the house without hurrying, and she did not look back, and she did not let her hands shake until she was through the kitchen door. Vern was sitting at the table drinking his 2nd cup of coffee. He had seen the whole thing through the window. He looked at Clara for a moment, then he looked back at his cup. "Edna Marsh," he said. "Lord have mercy." "Does she come around often?" Clara asked. "Not before today." He was quiet for a beat. "She came because she heard about you." "I know. She won't be the last." "I know that too." Vern was quiet again. Then he said, "You handled her right." He said it the way men of his generation say things they don't normally say, without making eye contact, almost under his breath, as if the words might blow away before he could be held responsible for them. Most women would have either cried or yelled. You didn't do either. Crying or yelling wouldn't have moved her, Clara said. No, he agreed. It wouldn't have. She cooked his lunch, and she didn't mention it again. But Edna Marsh was not the last. By the end of the first week, the town had built a story about Clara Bennett that bore very little resemblance to Clara Bennett. She was depending on who was talking a shameless woman who had used her father's death as an excuse to install herself in a vulnerable man's home. She was a schemer. She was desperate. She was throwing herself at a widower for the security of a roof over her head. And the physical details, her weight, her size, the way she moved through space were worked into every version of the story, like evidence of something, though no one could quite say what. Clara heard it the first time she went to town for supplies. She heard it in the way conversation stopped when she walked into the general store. She heard it in the specific silence that means people have just been talking about you. She heard it in the voice of the woman behind the counter, a flushed, soft-faced woman named Ruth, who kept glancing past Clara's shoulder, as if looking for someone more worth talking to, who said, while counting out change, "Must be quite a lot of work cooking for that many men." The inflection was careful. The meaning was not. "It keeps me busy," Clara said. She took her change and her supplies, and she went back to the wagon. She was tying the bags when she heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find a man she didn't recognize. 40s, sun-darkened, with the look of someone who has been outside in all weather for all his life, who said, "You're Harold Bennett's daughter." "I am. My name is Pete Dolan. I had a farm 12 miles east of your father's place." He paused. "Had." Clara went still. "Mercer took it," he said. 8 months ago. Forged debt same as he did to you. I've got 2 kids and a wife, and we're living out of a wagon right now." He was looking at her steadily without pity for himself, which Clara recognized as the specific pride of a man who has been ground down but not broken. "I heard you were working at Rowan Creek. I wanted to find you because somebody told me your father." He stopped, looked away, looked back. "Somebody told me your father might have kept records." The paper in her apron pocket felt suddenly like it weighed 20 pounds. "What kind of records?" she said. Her voice gave nothing away. "The kind that would show a pattern," Pete Dolan said quietly. "The kind that if a person had them, would mean Wade Mercer's been doing this across the county for 3 years, and the county recorder's been helping him do it." The weight of it settled over her. She had known what the paper said. She had read it 6 times. But hearing it spoken out loud in a stranger's voice on a public street in the town that had already decided she was worthless, that was different. That made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "I can't talk here," she said. "No," he agreed. "Rowan Creek, Sunday morning. Come to the kitchen door." He nodded. He walked away without another word. Clara climbed up onto the wagon seat, and she picked up the reins, and she sat there for a moment before she clicked the horses forward, and she thought about her father lying on his back in the hay, with his hand stretched out toward the door. She thought he knew. He had known what Wade Mercer was doing. He had been keeping a record of it, and he had hidden it where he knew she would find it inside his Bible pressed between the pages of Psalms, because he knew she was the one who read to him at night when his eyes were too tired. He had known something might happen to him. She didn't let herself think about that too long. She drove back to the ranch. That night after supper, Caleb Hayes stayed at the table after the other men had gone. Clara was at the stove, and she heard his chair not move, and she turned around. He was sitting with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and he was looking at the table, not at her. "I heard what Edna Marsh said to you," he said. "You didn't need to." "She's going to come back," he said. "Or someone like her will, and what she said about your reputation." He stopped. He looked up. "I want you to know that nothing that's being said in this town reflects on you. It reflects on them." Clara looked at him. "Mr. Hayes, I appreciate that." "Caleb," he said. She paused. "I appreciate that, Caleb, but I've been carrying what people say about this." She gestured at herself briefly without embarrassment. "My whole life. It doesn't go away when you have a roof over your head. It doesn't go away when you're useful. It just changes shape a little. He was watching her with the gray eyes and the expression that was not quite closed off, not quite open. "Doesn't it make you angry?" he said. "Every single day," Clara said. "But anger without direction is just noise. I'm not interested in noise." He was quiet for a long moment. "My wife," he started, and then he stopped. He looked back at the table. "Eleanor. People talked about her too, after she got sick. They talked about whether I was caring for her right, whether the ranch was too much for a sick woman, whether I should have sent her to her family." His jaw tightened. People talk when they're afraid of something they don't understand. When someone's life doesn't look the way they think a life should look. "What did you do?" Clara asked quietly. "I stopped going to town," he said. "Stopped listening." He paused. "Probably not the right answer." "Probably the human one," she said. He looked up at her again, and this time the expression was different. Not the assessing look of the first night, not the wary look of a man measuring a stranger. Something else. Something she filed away without examining too closely because she was not ready for it yet, and she suspected he wasn't either. "You're nothing like what I expected," he said. And it didn't sound like a compliment exactly. It sounded like the truth, which was better. "What did you expect?" she asked. "Someone quieter," he said. "Someone who kept their head down." "I've tried that," Clara said. "It doesn't work." He almost smiled. "No," he said. "I don't reckon it does." Sunday morning, Pete Dolan came to the kitchen door. Clara brought him inside and sat him at the table and poured him coffee, and they sat across from each other in the early light, and she took the paper out and she laid it flat on the table between them. Pete Dolan looked at it. His face changed. "That's," he said. "My father kept a record," Clara said. "Names, dates, amounts. Every family Mercer went after. He wrote down the pattern how Mercer would wait for a death in the family. How he'd come in with the forged documents within a week. How the county recorder's office processed everything without question." She pressed her finger to a line near the bottom. "And this, right here. This is the name of the notary who signed every single one of those documents. The same notary. 8 families, 3 years, 1 notary." Pete Dolan sat back in his chair. He put his hand over his mouth. "We need a lawyer," he said. "We need more than a lawyer," Clara said. "We need people willing to stand up, and right now people are scared." "They are." He looked at her. "But if someone showed them they didn't have to be—" The kitchen door opened. Caleb Hayes stood in the doorway. He looked at Pete Dolan. He looked at Clara. He looked at the paper on the table. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he walked to the table, pulled out a chair and sat down. "Tell me," he said. Clara looked at him. "This isn't your fight." "No," Caleb said. "But it's happening on my land, and it was done to my neighbor's daughter, and that makes it close enough." He looked at Pete Dolan. "Who else has Mercer taken from—" Pete named 4 families. Caleb knew 3 of them. "Bill Hargrove," Caleb said when Pete mentioned the name. "Bill lost his place 6 months ago. I thought it was the drought." His jaw tightened. "It wasn't the drought." "No," Pete said. "It wasn't." The silence stretched between the 3 of them like wire pulled tight. Clara watched Caleb's face, and she saw the moment it moved through him, the anger, and underneath the anger, something older. Something that looked on a man who had taught himself not to feel too much exactly like grief. "What do you need?" he said. He was looking at Clara when he said it. Clara folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. "Time," she said. "And someone with enough standing in this county that when we move, people listen." Caleb Hayes put both hands flat on the table. "I've got standing," he said. "I know you do," Clara said. "That's why I came here." The words landed between them, and neither of them looked away. Outside the yard was waking up horses moving, the sound of boots on hard ground. Tom and Jesse arguing about something in the distance, the way they always did. The ordinary sounds of a working morning. Inside the kitchen, something had just shifted that could not be shifted back. Pete Dolan looked between the two of them and cleared his throat. "I'll reach out to the other families," he said, quietly. "See who's willing to talk." "Carefully," Clara said. "If Mercer hears we're gathering—" "He'll move first," Pete finished. "He'll move first," she agreed. "And we won't be ready." Pete nodded. He stood and he took his hat from the table, and he looked at Clara with something in his face that wasn't quite hope, because a man in Pete Dolan's situation had used up most of his hope months ago. But it was something adjacent to it. Something that had been waiting in the dark for something to attach itself to. "Your father was a good man," he said. "I know," Clara said. After Pete left, the kitchen was quiet. Clara stood at the stove and she picked up her spoon and she stirred the pot that didn't need stirring, and she listened to Caleb Hayes still sitting at her table. "Clara," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the gray eyes and the expression she had filed away and not examined. "Whatever happens," he said, "whatever Mercer does next, you've got a place here." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. "Don't make promises you might regret," she said quietly. "I don't," he said. And the way he said it, flat certain without decoration, was the most frightening and the most solid thing anyone had said to her since her father died. She turned back to the stove. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. And somewhere across the county, Wade Mercer was already hearing things. Fragments whispers the specific sound of people who are starting very quietly to talk to each other. And a man like Wade Mercer, who had built his entire empire on the silence of frightened people, knew exactly what that sound meant. He would not wait long. Wade Mercer moved on a Thursday. Clara knew something was wrong before she heard the horses. She was at the stove the way she always was at that hour, and she felt it first, a change in the air, a stillness in the yard that didn't match the time of morning. Then she heard the gate and the sound of more than one horse, and the particular weight of boots on ground that belong to men who are not there to be friendly. She dried her hands on her apron. She did not run to the window. She did not call for Caleb. She stood very still in the middle of the kitchen, and she breathed once slowly, and she reached into her apron pocket, and her fingers found the folded paper, and then she walked to the kitchen door, and she opened it. Wade Mercer stood in the yard with 4 men behind him and a lawyer at his side. Not Elias Dowd this time, but a harder-looking man in a black coat who carried a leather satchel, and the expression of someone who had been paid to make problems disappear. Caleb Hayes was already there. He had come out of the barn, and he stood between the house and Mercer's men, with his arms loose at his sides, and his face the specific kind of calm that is not calmness at all, but is the place a man goes just before he decides something. Vern was behind him. Tom and Jesse had come around the side of the barn without being asked. "Hayes," Mercer said like a greeting that wasn't. "Mercer," Caleb said, "you want to tell me why you rode onto my property with armed men?" "Business," Mercer said. "With her." He didn't look at Clara when he said it. He pointed at her, like she was an object in the yard he was identifying for someone who couldn't see well. Clara walked down the porch steps, and she stood beside Caleb. Mercer looked at her then. And she saw it, the thing she had seen at her father's funeral and not understood yet. The particular coldness of a man who has never once in his life been afraid of consequences. "You've been talking to people," he said. "Dolan, the Hargrove woman, the family over at Miller Creek." "People talk," Clara said. "You've been spreading lies about legally filed documents." "I've been telling the truth about forged ones," she said. "There's a difference." The lawyer stepped forward. He opened the satchel and produced a folded document and held it out. "Miss Bennett, this is a court order requiring you to surrender any documents in your possession relating to the estate of Harold Bennett. You have until—" "Where'd you file that?" Caleb said. The lawyer looked at him with the patient condescension of a man who thinks legal language is a weapon ordinary people can't use. "The county court, Mr. Hayes. Judge Peel," Caleb said. The lawyer paused. "Because Judge Peel and Wade Mercer have been hunting together every November for 14 years, Caleb said. "So I'm curious how fast that order got signed." Something moved across Mercer's face. Fast and then gone. "This isn't your business, Hayes," he said. "She works on my property," Caleb said. "That makes it my business. She is the subject of a legal proceeding. She's a woman standing on my land," Caleb said. "And you rode in here with 4 armed men to frighten her into giving you something she doesn't have to give you. And I'm telling you right now, Wade—" He dropped the formal address, and his voice dropped with it going quieter, which was somehow worse than if he'd raised it. "That's not happening today." Mercer looked at Clara. "You think this man can protect you?" he said. "You think one ranch and one stubborn cowboy is going to stand between you and what I can bring down on you? I have the county recorder. I have the judge. I have the sheriff." "You had the sheriff?" Clara said. Mercer went very still. She had been waiting for the right moment. She had been carrying it for 3 days since Pete Dolan had come back to the kitchen door with news that made her breath catch. She pulled the paper from her pocket. Not the original, the copy she had made, the one she had written herself in her own hand, with every name and date her father had recorded plus 3 more she had added herself, and she held it up. "Roy Tibbets came to see me 2 days ago," she said. "Not as sheriff, as a neighbor." She watched Mercer's face. "Turns out Roy Tibbets has a brother-in-law who lost his farm to you 18 months ago, and Roy's been carrying that around for a long time." She looked at Mercer steadily. "He told me what you offered him to stay quiet. He told me what you threatened him with when he hesitated." She paused. "He wrote it down, signed it, and it is not on this property." The yard was absolutely silent. Mercer's lawyer was looking at his client with an expression Clara recognized, the expression of a man who has just realized that what he was told before he took the job was not the whole story. "You're bluffing," Mercer said. His voice was flat. "Am I?" Clara said. "Roy Tibbets has worked for this county for 12 years. He's not going to—" "He came to me," Clara said. "I didn't go to him. He came to me and he sat in that kitchen and he told me everything." She took one step forward. Just one. Because people who have been carrying shame long enough eventually put it down, not because someone forces them to, because it gets too heavy. She held Mercer's gaze. "You understand that better than most, don't you, Wade?" One of Mercer's hired men shifted his weight. The leather of a saddle creaked somewhere behind her. "Get off my property," Caleb said, quietly, finally. Mercer looked at him. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Caleb agreed. "It isn't, but this part of it is." For a long moment, Mercer didn't move. He was the kind of man who needed to be the last one to move in every situation, who had built his entire sense of himself around the idea that he was the one who decided when things ended. Clara watched him calculate. She watched him weigh it. Then he turned his horse. His men followed. The lawyer closed his satchel and went last, and he didn't look at any of them. The gate closed. Nobody in the yard moved for a full 10 seconds. Then Vern let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. Jesse said something under his breath that was either a prayer or a curse, possibly both. Tom walked to the fence and put his hands on it and leaned there like a man who has just been told the storm missed them. Caleb turned and looked at Clara. She was still standing with the paper in her hand. "Roy Tibbets really came to you," he said. 2 days ago," she said. "Yes. You didn't tell me." She met his eyes. "I wasn't sure he'd hold," she said. "Men who decide to do the right thing sometimes change their minds between deciding and doing. I didn't want to build a plan on a foundation that might not hold." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Clara," he said. "Next time, tell me." It wasn't anger. It was something quieter and more serious than anger. It was the voice of a man who is asking to be let in. "All right," she said. "Next time." The trouble was, she was wrong about Roy Tibbets. Not about what he'd told her. Every word of it had been true, but she'd been wrong about him holding. She found out the next morning when Pete Dolan rode to the gate at first light, hard and fast, and came off his horse before it had fully stopped and said, "Tibbets recanted." Clara felt the ground shift under her. When? Last night. Mercer got to him. Pete's face was tight and white around the edges. I don't know what he said, or what he promised, or what he threatened, but Roy Tibbets went to the county courthouse last night and filed a statement saying he had been pressured into making false claims by a woman with a vendetta against Wade Mercer. He looked at Clara. He named you. The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb was standing in the doorway. He had been there long enough to hear all of it. All right, Clara said. Pete looked at her. All right, Clara, without Tibbets. Without Tibbets, we still have my father's record, she said. We still have the pattern. We still have 8 families. She sat down at the table slowly, the way you sit down when you need the solid surface underneath you. What we don't have is the inside witness who could make the county take it seriously in one move. She pressed her hands flat on the table. So we have to make them take it seriously another way. How? Pete said. She looked up at him, then at Caleb. All 8 families, she said. Every single one. They come to town the same day at the same time, and they stand in the street in front of the courthouse and they tell their story. Not to the sheriff, not to the judge, to everybody. She paused. Mercer has the legal system because the legal system happens in rooms that most people never see, but he doesn't own the street. Pete was quiet. That's, he started. Dangerous, Caleb said. Yes, Clara said. It is. Mercer will come back at every one of them harder than before, Caleb said. If this doesn't work, he'll make examples out of all of them. And if we do nothing, Clara said, he keeps going. He finds the next family and the next and the next, and each time it's easier because nobody has ever made him stop. She looked at Caleb. It has to be public. It has to be loud. It has to be the kind of thing people can't unsee. Caleb looked at her for a long time. Then he said, I'll ride with you. Caleb, I've got standing in this county, he said. You said that yourself. If I stand up next to those families in the street, people listen. You know that. She did know that. And she hated that she needed it to be true. She hated that a woman with her father's evidence and her own testimony, and the testimony of 8 families, still needed a man with a name they respected to make the town believe her. She hated it with the specific clean anger she had been keeping carefully banked her whole life. But she was not interested in what should be true. She was interested in what was true. Saturday, she said. Market day. The most people in town. Saturday. Caleb agreed. She spent Thursday writing. Every name her father had recorded, every date, every amount organized in the clearest language she could manage, a document that a person with no legal training could read in 5 minutes and understand completely. She made 7 copies by hand. Pete took them to the other families. Friday night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow cot in the small room off the kitchen, and she stared at the ceiling, and she listened to the ranch settle around her. The creak of wood, the distant sound of one of the horses shifting in the barn, the wind. She had been in this room for 3 weeks. She knew its sounds the way she had once known her father's house, the specific vocabulary of a building that is becoming familiar. She was still awake when she heard the footsteps in the kitchen. She sat up. The footsteps stopped outside her door. Clara. Caleb's voice. Low. You awake? Yes. I saw the light go out hours ago. Figured you might not be sleeping. She almost smiled. What gave it away? The fact that I'm not sleeping either. A pause. I made coffee, if you want. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and she opened the door, and she went and sat at the kitchen table in the middle of the night and drank coffee with Caleb Hayes, and neither of them talked about tomorrow. They talked about his wife Eleanor, the way she used to reorganize the entire kitchen once a month, and how he'd learned not to look for anything for 3 days afterward. They talked about Clara's mother, who had died when Clara was 12, and who had been, by all accounts, the kind of woman who made a room feel warmer just by walking into it. They talked about the land, how it got into you, how losing it was a specific kind of grief that people who'd never owned land couldn't quite understand. At some point, the coffee was gone, and neither of them moved to make more. "Are you afraid?" Caleb said. "Yes," Clara said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. She looked at him across the table, and something in her chest pulled tight, not painfully, but with the specific ache of something coming back to life after a long time of being still. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "thank you for taking me in, for—" She stopped. "For seeing me." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Your father raised someone worth seeing," he said. She looked down at her hands on the table. His hand was 6 inches from hers. Neither of them moved. "Get some sleep," he said finally, gently. "You too," she said. Saturday came the way hard days always come too fast, and then all at once. By 9 in the morning, Clara was standing in the middle of the main street of town with Pete Dolan on her left and Caleb Hayes on her right, and behind them in a line that stretched back farther than she had dared hope. 7 families who had each lost something to Wade Mercer, and who had each separately and together decided that today was the day they put the weight down. The town was busy. Market day meant people, horses, wagons, noise, and then gradually the noise shifted as people noticed them. Conversation stopped. A woman pulled her child closer. Men at the hitching post turned to look. Clara looked straight ahead. And then Wade Mercer came out of the land office across the street with his lawyer behind him, and he stopped dead on the boardwalk. And he looked at the line of people in the street, and his face did something she had never seen it do before. For just one moment, one brief, involuntary moment, Wade Mercer looked afraid. Clara stepped forward. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The street was quiet enough by then that her voice carried without effort. "My name is Clara Bennett," she said, "Harold Bennett's daughter. 3 weeks ago this man," she looked directly at Mercer, "used a forged document to steal my family's land the week after my father died." She held up the paper. "I have my father's record of every family he's done this to. I have 8 families standing behind me who will tell you the same story with different names." She paused. "And I want everyone in this town to hear it." A door opened across the street. Another. A woman Clara had never met stepped off a boardwalk and walked toward them and stood behind Pete Dolan without a word. Then another. Mercer's lawyer said something to him close and urgent. Mercer didn't move. Clara looked at him, and she said the thing she had been carrying since the morning she found her father in the hay. "You spent your whole life trying to make people feel small," she said. "Because somewhere inside you, you've always known that's exactly what you are." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Roy Tibbets walked out of the sheriff's office. Clara heard him before she saw him. The sound of boots on boardwalk planks, deliberate and slow. The way a man walks when he has made a decision that cannot be unmade. She turned her head, and there he was. Roy Tibbets, thin and pale, under the brim of his hat, with dark circles under his eyes, and the look of a man who had not slept in 3 days. He was not wearing his badge. He was carrying it in his hand, and when he reached the edge of the street, he stopped, and he looked at Clara, and he said loud enough for the whole street to hear, "What she said is true." Everything shifted. Mercer's lawyer took 1 step back. Just one. But Clara saw it. "Roy," Mercer said. His voice had changed. There was something in it she had never heard before. "I filed a false statement," Roy Tibbets said. He wasn't looking at Mercer. He was looking at the street, at the families standing behind Clara, at the faces of people he had known for 12 years. "I said what he told me to say because I was scared. Because he knew things about my family, and he used them." He stopped, swallowed. "My brother-in-law lost his farm. I knew it was wrong, and I stayed quiet, and I filed that statement, and I have not slept since." He held up the badge. "I'm done." Pete Dolan made a sound beside Clara that was not quite a word. Mercer moved. Fast for a large man, he stepped off the boardwalk, and he crossed the street in 4 strides, and he stopped in front of Roy Tibbets, and he said very quietly, "Think very carefully about what you're doing." Roy Tibbets looked at him. And then Roy Tibbets did something that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. He didn't argue. He didn't flinch. He simply looked at the man who had owned him for 3 years, and he said, "I already thought about it." He turned to the crowd. "Someone needs to ride for the territorial marshal," he said, "because I won't be the one making the arrest, but I'll be the one signing the statement." 2 men on horseback were gone before he finished the sentence. What happened next was not fast, the way stories sometimes make it sound. Justice is rarely fast, but it was steady, and steadiness, Clara had learned, was more reliable than speed. Mercer's lawyer disappeared. Somewhere between the street and the edge of town. Pete Dolan said later he'd seen the man's horse heading south at a pace that suggested he had urgent business elsewhere and no intention of looking back. Mercer himself stood in the middle of the street for a long moment, surrounded by a town that had just watched the architecture of his power collapse in a single morning, and he looked for the first time in Clara's experience of him like a man who was genuinely uncertain what to do next. He tried once more. He turned to the crowd and he spread his hands and he said, "This woman has a grudge against me. You all know that. Her father's debt was legal, every document." "My husband signed no debt," said a woman's voice from the back of the crowd. Clara turned. She hadn't seen the woman before. Small, gray-haired, with the straight back of someone who has carried difficulty without letting it bend her. She walked through the crowd until she was standing beside Clara, and she looked at Mercer and she said, "My name is Agnes Hargrove. My husband Bill died in February. You came to our door in March with papers he supposedly signed 6 months before he died." She paused. "My husband's right hand was crushed in a threshing accident 4 years ago. He couldn't hold a pen. He hadn't signed his own name in 4 years. Her voice didn't shake. "Every person in this town who knew Bill Hargrove knows that. And every person in this town who looked at that signature and said nothing." She looked around her slowly, deliberately, has to decide what that means about them. The crowd was absolutely still. Caleb stepped forward until he was standing beside Clara, and the weight of him there, the steadiness of it, was something she felt rather than saw. "It's done, Wade," he said. "Let it be done." Mercer looked at him, at Clara, at the line of families behind her, at the faces of a town that had gone quiet with the particular quiet of people who have just understood something they should have understood a long time ago. He walked to his horse. He didn't ride south the way his lawyer had. He rode back toward his own property, and his back was straight and his head was up, and Clara watched him go and felt nothing. She had expected to feel no triumph, no relief, not yet. Just the strange, hollow aftermath of a thing that had been building for so long, that now that it had happened, her body didn't quite know what to do with the space it left. Caleb's hand found her shoulder, brief, solid. "You all right?" he said. "Ask me tomorrow," she said. He almost smiled. The territorial marshal arrived on Wednesday. He was a broad, deliberate man named Samuel Cross, who rode in with 2 deputies and spent 3 days going through documents, taking statements, and conducting interviews in the back room of the general store, because the sheriff's office was for the moment complicated. He spoke to Clara twice. He spoke to each of the 8 families. He spoke to Roy Tibbets for 4 hours on the second day, and when he came out of that room, his face was the specific expression of a man who has heard something that has made him tired in a way that sleep won't fix. He arrested Wade Mercer on Friday morning. Clara was at the ranch when it happened. She heard about it from Jesse, who had ridden to town for supplies, and came back with his hat pushed back on his head, and an expression of combined satisfaction and disbelief. "They rode out to his place with a warrant," Jesse said. 4 of them. Mercer came to the door and Cross read the charges, and Mercer just... He paused, searching for the right word. He just nodded, like he'd been expecting it. Like somewhere inside he'd always known this was where it ended. Clara listened. She was rolling biscuit dough when Jesse told her, and she kept rolling. "The county recorder?" she asked. "Arrested yesterday," Jesse said. "Along with the notary." He sat down at the table. "Miss Bennett, Clara, there's going to be a process, a legal one. Getting the land back to people officially is going to take time," Clara said. "I know. Months, maybe. These things move slow. I know that too. She cut the biscuits and laid them in the pan and slid the pan toward the oven. Pete Dolan's family. The marshal says the Dolan farm should be among the first returned. The evidence there is strongest. She nodded. Something in her chest loosened slightly. Not all the way, not yet, but enough. She thought about Pete Dolan's face when he'd told her he was living out of a wagon. She thought about his kids. Good, she said. It took 11 days for the marshal to formally file the legal action that would begin the process of returning Clara's family ranch to her. 11 days that passed the way all waiting passes too slowly when you were watching and too fast when you looked back. On the 12th day, Marshal Cross came to Rowan Creek himself. Clara was outside when he rode up, and she watched him dismount and tie his horse and walk toward her with the deliberate pace she had come to associate with him. A man who had learned that arriving calmly made everything that came next easier. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Marshal." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "The lien your father's property was placed under has been formally voided by the territorial court. The forged nature of the original documents has been entered into the court record. Your father's land," he held the document out to her, "is yours." Clara looked at the document in his hand. She didn't take it immediately. She stood looking at it for a moment, and she thought about her father in the hay with his hand reaching toward the door, and she thought about the morning she had walked out of that house and hadn't looked back, and she thought about 6 miles of summer road and no shade and nobody stopping. She took the document. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. "Thank your father," Cross said. "He kept good records." After he left, she stood in the yard holding the paper for a long time. Caleb found her there. He didn't say anything. He came and stood beside her, and he looked at the paper in her hands, and he was quiet in the particular way that meant he understood what the quiet was for. "It's mine," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "I should go back." She folded the paper carefully. "I should start putting it right. The house needs work, the land hasn't been worked, and Clara." She stopped. He was looking at her with the gray eyes and the expression that had been building for weeks, the one she had been carefully not examining. "Stay through winter," he said. She looked at him. "The ranch needs a cook," he said, and then he stopped, and something in his face shifted, and he said, "That's not... I'm not saying it right." He looked away, jaw working, and then he looked back. "I'm asking you to stay because this place is different with you in it. Because my men eat better, and sleep better, and argue less, and work harder. Because Vern told me last week that the ranch felt like a home again for the first time in 3 years, and I didn't know how to disagree with him." He paused. "And because the idea of you leaving..." He stopped. Started again. "Because I don't want you to go." Clara held his gaze for a long moment. "Caleb," she said, "you understand what you're saying." "I do." "The town will talk." "The town," he said, "just watched you stand in the middle of their street and bring down Wade Mercer. They can say whatever they like." She almost laughed. It surprised her, the laugh coming up through the tightness in her chest, like light through a crack. "I'm not easy to be around," she said. "I have opinions. I don't back down from things. I'll run your kitchen the way I see fit, and if your men have complaints, they'll hear about it." "I know," he said, "and I am not." She gestured at herself, the same brief gesture she had made weeks ago without apology. "I am not going to change. I'm not going to be different than I am." "I'm not asking you to be," Caleb said, and the way he said it, direct, without hesitation, without the careful diplomatic phrasing of a man trying to say the right thing, landed somewhere deep. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "Because the woman I see in front of me walked 6 miles on bleeding feet and kept a secret that could have gotten her killed and stood in the street of this town and told the truth when every person in power was telling her she didn't matter." He paused. "That's not a woman who needs fixing." Clara looked at the folded paper in her hands. She thought about what her father used to say, that the land would be there when everything else was uncertain. That it was the thing you came back to. She thought about the small room off the kitchen, and the narrow cot, and the sound of the ranch settling at night. She thought about coffee at midnight, and Caleb's voice in the dark saying the truest things in the quietest way. She thought about her mother's ring on her finger and what it would mean to take it off. She wasn't ready for that, not yet, but she could feel the shape of the future differently than she had 3 weeks ago. Not as a thing to survive, but as a thing that might with patience become something worth having. "Through winter," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly. More like a man who has been holding his breath for a long time and has finally carefully let it go. "Through winter," he agreed. What happened next, nobody planned. The ranch hand. Tom's younger sister arrived 2 weeks later, 18 years old, with a bruise on her jaw. She didn't explain, and a bag that held everything she owned, and a look in her eyes that Clara recognized the way you recognize your own reflection. Clara put her in the spare room and didn't ask questions, and gave her work, and let the questions come in their own time. They came, slowly over days. And the story they told made Clara's jaw tighten and her hands go still and then go back to work because the working was the thing she knew how to do. Pete Dolan's family came for Sunday dinner 3 weeks after they moved back to their farm. All 5 of them crowded around Clara's table with the noisy, complicated, overlapping energy of a family that has been through something terrible together and has come out the other side still intact. His youngest daughter fell asleep in Clara's kitchen chair after supper, and Pete carried her out to the wagon and came back in and looked at Clara with the specific look of a man who owes more than he knows how to say. "We wouldn't be going home," he said, "if not for you." "Your family is going home because your family didn't give up," Clara said. "I just helped." "That's not Pete." He stopped. "Let it be what it is," she said. "You're going home. That's enough." Agnes Hargrove came on a Tuesday with a jar of preserved plums and sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours and talked about Bill, her husband, the way he laughed, the way he fixed things with wire and determination and no formal skill whatsoever, the way the farm had been theirs in a way that a house never quite is. Clara listened. She made coffee. She didn't try to fix anything. When Agnes left, she held Clara's hand in both of hers for a moment and said, "You know what you are, girl." "What?" Clara said. "A place people can come to," Agnes said. "Not everybody knows how to be that. Most people never figure it out." Clara stood in the doorway and watched Agnes walk to her wagon, and she felt something settle in her. Not the dramatic, sudden settling of a thing resolved, but the quiet, gradual kind. The kind that happens when you realize slowly that you have become somewhere you recognize. Vern noticed it first the way Vern noticed most things, without ceremony, without making a production of it. He said it one morning at breakfast when the table was full and loud, and Tom and Jesse were arguing, and Pete Dolan's oldest boy was helping with chores in the yard, and the smell of Clara's cooking was in every corner of the room. He said, "This place used to feel like somewhere a person was passing through." He said it to nobody in particular, the way old men say things they've been thinking for a while. "Now it feels like somewhere a person stays." Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. But Clara at the stove heard it, and Caleb at the end of the table looked up and found her eyes across the room. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Outside, the first cold of autumn was settling over the Montana plain, and the ranch was full of people, and the kitchen was warm. Winter came to Montana the way it always did without asking permission. The first snow fell in November, light and quiet, and by December, the ground was hard, and the mornings were dark, and the work of keeping a ranch alive through cold required every pair of hands available. Clara was up before anyone the way she always was, and she went to bed last, and somewhere in the rhythm of those long winter days, something happened that she hadn't planned for and couldn't have predicted. She stopped counting. She stopped counting the days since her father died. She stopped counting the weeks since she had walked through Caleb's gate. She stopped measuring herself against the life she'd lost, and started without noticing the exact moment it began living inside the one she had. Tom's sister. Her name was Miriam, which she told Clara on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after she arrived, as if the name itself was something she'd been deciding whether to trust her with, started helping in the kitchen. She was quiet, watchful with quick hands, and a mind that moved faster than she let people see. Clara didn't push. She gave her work and space and the particular dignity of being treated as capable, and Miriam opened up the way things open when they're given time, instead of force, gradually, then all at once. One morning Miriam said, "How do you do it?" Clara was kneading bread. She didn't stop. "Do what?" "Not care what they say about you." Miriam was looking at her hands. "In town. I heard what they said about you when you first came. I heard what Edna Marsh said. And you kept going." Clara thought about this for a moment. She kept working the dough. "I care," she said. "Don't let anybody tell you that the people who keep going don't feel it. They feel it same as anyone." She folded the dough over. "But there's a difference between feeling something and letting it decide for you." She looked at Miriam. "The people who said those things, what do they know about what I'm worth? They don't know what I've done. They don't know what I've carried. They looked at the outside of me and made a story up." She shrugged. "That's their story, not mine." Miriam was quiet for a long moment. "I want to learn how to do that," she said. "Think like that." "You already do," Clara said. "You walked out of somewhere that was hurting you. That took more courage than anything I've done." Miriam looked up. Her eyes were bright in a way they hadn't been when she arrived. "You really think so?" "I do," Clara said. "Simply, without decoration. Because the truth didn't need decorating." December deepened. The ranch ran on a tighter rhythm in winter. Less noise, more purpose. The specific economy of cold that strips everything down to what matters. Caleb worked hard the way he always did. But Clara noticed that he came in for meals now, instead of taking them in the barn or the field, the way Vern said he used to. He sat at the table. He talked to his men. He asked about things that had happened during the day, with the genuine interest of a man who was relearning how to be present in his own life. She noticed. She didn't remark on it, but she noticed. On Christmas Eve, she made a meal that used the last of the preserved peaches and the good flour, and a recipe her mother had taught her that she had not made since her mother was alive. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing or why. She just made it. And when the men sat down and the food was on the table, Vern looked at his plate and said, "Lord have mercy," in a voice that had nothing to do with the Lord and everything to do with the food. After supper, when the table had been cleared and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Miriam had gone to bed, Caleb stayed. He stayed the way he had started staying naturally, without announcement, as if the kitchen at night was a place he had always belonged. He said, "Tell me something." Clara was at the sink. "That's not a question." "Tell me something about your mother." She stopped. She set down the dish she was holding. She turned around. He was sitting at the table with his coffee and his gray eyes and his expression that was no longer closed and no longer careful, the one that had been building since the first night she cooked supper for 8 skeptical men who didn't expect her to stay. She sat down across from him. She told him about her mother, about the way she sang, while she worked always slightly off-key, and completely unashamed of it. About the ring she had given Clara at 12 years old the day before she got too sick to get out of bed, and how she had pressed it into Clara's palm and said, "You hold this until the right time. You'll know when." About the way the house had felt different without her, not empty exactly, but like a song missing its melody. Caleb listened, the way he listened to everything completely without interrupting, without reaching for the right thing to say. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Eleanor used to say, "He started and he stopped, and she waited." She used to say that the people we lose don't go away. They just change the way they're with us. He looked at his coffee cup. "I thought that was just something people said, something comfortable." He looked up. "I don't think that anymore." "What changed?" Clara asked. "You came in here with your father's Bible and his record of 8 families he'd been watching over, and you sat in this kitchen, and you used what he taught you to do something he started." He held her gaze. "That's not gone. That's him still working. Through you. Clara felt something move through her. Not grief, not quite. Something older and quieter than grief. The thing that comes after grief when you're not looking for it. Caleb, she said. Yeah. She reached across the table and she put her hand over his. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Through winter, he said quietly. That's what you said. I know what I said. Winter's almost done. I know that too. He turned his hand over under hers, and his fingers closed around hers, and he said, What comes after winter, Clara? She looked at him in the lamplight of his kitchen, in the middle of a Montana winter, in a life that had been taken apart and rebuilt into something she hadn't expected, something that fit her better than anything she had known before. Something worth keeping, she said. January was brutal, and February was worse, and Clara didn't leave, and nobody expected her to anymore. Pete Dolan came in February, with news that the territorial court had officially recorded the land transfers as void. All 8 properties formally returned to their original owners. The county recorder had accepted a plea. The notary had done the same. And Wade Mercer, who had sat in the territorial jail since November, with a lawyer who was running out of things to argue, was looking at charges that would keep him occupied for a very long time. Pete delivered this news at Clara's kitchen table with his hat in his hands and his voice not quite steady. It's done, he said. It's actually done. Clara poured him coffee. Bill Hargrove's wife, Pete said. Agnes. She asked me to give you something. He reached into his coat and produced a small folded piece of paper. Said you'd understand. Clara opened it. It was one line in careful old-fashioned handwriting, a place people can come to. That's what you are. Clara folded it and put it in her pocket beside her father's folded record, which she still carried even though there was no longer any strategic reason to, because it was his handwriting and she wasn't ready to be without it. Thank your family for us, Pete, she said, for standing up when it would have been easier not to. Thank you, Pete said, for making us believe it was possible. March arrived and the snow began slowly, and then less slowly, to release its grip. Miriam had by March quietly taken over a portion of the kitchen responsibilities that freed Clara to work on her father's property, which required, as she had always known, it would significant work. She rode out there on the first warm Tuesday, just herself and her horse, and she walked through the house, and she walked the fence lines, and she stood for a long time at her father's grave. She talked to him the way she used to when he was alive, directly without preamble. I'm staying, she said. At Rowan Creek. I want you to know that's not because I gave up on this place. She put her hand on the wooden cross. It's because I found somewhere that needs me, and someone. She paused. I think you'd understand that. The wind moved through the grass. She took it as an answer. She rode back to Rowan Creek in the late afternoon, with the low sun at her back and the sound of the ranch coming up to meet her. Before she could see it, horses' voices, the hammer sound of someone working on the south fence. She came through the gate, and Jessie waved from across the yard, and Miriam appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, Supper's almost ready, with the specific pride of someone trying something new. Caleb was at the paddock fence. He turned when he heard her horse, and he watched her dismount, and she could feel his eyes on her from across the yard, with the particular weight of a person who has been waiting without knowing exactly what they were waiting for. She walked her horse to the post, and she looped the reins, and she walked to him. How was it? He said. Hard, she said. Good. He nodded. He looked at her face, reading it the way he had gotten quietly expert at reading it, and whatever he saw there settled something in him. She could see it. I talked to him, she said. My father. What did you say? That I'm staying. The evening light was doing something specific to everything, the kind of light that only comes in early spring when the world is remembering warmth and not quite sure it trusts the memory yet. Caleb reached into his coat pocket. He produced something small, and he held it out in his open palm, and Clara looked down at it. It was a ring. Plain silver, thin, with a small blue stone she didn't know the name of. It was not new, she could see that. It had been worn before, and polished, and it held in its quiet simplicity the specific beauty of a thing that has been chosen carefully by someone who was not trying to impress anybody. "This was my grandmother's," he said. "She came west when she was 19 years old, with nothing but a trunk and a husband who died 3 years after they arrived, and she raised 4 children on a farm alone in Wyoming, and she wore this every day for 60 years. He paused. "She would have liked you. She would have recognized you." Clara looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at her own left hand where her mother's ring had lived for 22 years, and she thought about the morning her mother had pressed it into her palm and said, "You'll know when." She had known for a while now. She had been letting the knowing settle, making sure it was real, and not just the warmth of shelter and safety, and the relief of being seen. She had waited through the worst of winter, the way the land waited, not passively, but purposefully, building something underground that wouldn't show until spring. Spring had come. "Caleb Hayes," she said. Her voice was steady, completely steady. "I am not easy. I am not small. I am not going to become quieter or thinner or less than I am to make anybody more comfortable." "I know," he said. "I will run this kitchen the way I see fit, and I will have opinions about everything, and I will not pretend otherwise." "Clara," he said. "What?" "I know," he said again. Quietly. Certainly. The way he said every true thing without decoration, without hedging, as if the truth was simply the truth, and he saw no reason to dress it up or down. She took the ring from his palm. She held it for a moment. Then she slid it onto her left hand beside her mother's ring, and she looked up at him and she said, "Yes." He let out a breath, slow, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying for a very long time. He put his hands on either side of her face carefully, the way he handled things that mattered, and he pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood like that for a moment in the early spring evening, with the sound of the ranch around them, and the smell of Miriam's supper coming through the kitchen window, and the first real warmth of the year moving across the Montana plain. They were married on a Saturday in April. Not in the church. Clara had not forgotten what the church had said about her, and Caleb had not forgotten either. They were married in the yard of Rowan Creek Ranch, with Vern standing up for Caleb and Pete Dolan's wife beside Clara, and every hand on the property in their best clothes, and Agnes Hargrove in the front